Story 1. There's something unsettling about walking alone at night, even in a place you've known for years. The silence feels heavier, and the shadows stretch longer than they should. I've always enjoyed late-night walks around my property. It's a big farm, quiet and peaceful, and it helps clear my mind after a long day in the workshop. I've been a welder for over 40 years, and ever since my wife Maria passed away, it's just been me and my dog, Bosley. He's a good companion, always by my side, but lately even he seems uneasy when we walk the property. One evening, I was making my usual loop around the house. The air was cool, and the only sound was the rustling of leaves under my boots. Bosley trotted beside me, his ears perked up like he was listening for something I couldn't hear. As I walked past the front of the house, I glanced up at the second-story window, the one that used to be Maria's favorite spot. For a split second, I thought I saw something move behind the glass. My heart skipped a beat and I stopped in my tracks, staring at the window. It didn't make sense. That room had been empty for years. I couldn't bring myself to go inside it after she was gone. I stood there for a moment, trying to convince myself that it was nothing, just my tired eyes playing tricks on me. But Bosley let out a low growl, his body stiffening. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. There was no reason anyone should be in there. My hands tightened into fists, and a wave of anger rushed over me. If someone had broken into my house, I wasn't going to let them get away with it. I hurried back inside, my heart pounding in my chest as I climbed the stairs. When I reached the room, I hesitated before pushing the door open. Inside, everything was exactly the way I had left it, dust covering the furniture, Maria's old belongings still packed away in boxes. There was no sign of anyone, no footprints in the dust, nothing out of place. I let out a shaky breath and shook my head, feeling a little foolish. Maybe it was just my imagination. But deep down, something didn't feel right. As I stood in the middle of the room, staring at the untouched furniture, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been watching me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every little sound in the house seemed louder than usual. The ticking of the old clock in the hallway, the faint creaks of the wooden floors, and the occasional rustling of leaves outside the window. Bosley lay at the foot of my bed, his ears twitching at every noise. I tried to tell myself that it was just the old house settling, that I was letting my imagination get the best of me. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that someone had been in that room earlier. A little after midnight, Bosley suddenly lifted his head, his body tense. A low growl rumbled from his throat, and his eyes fixed on the ceiling. I sat up, listening carefully. At first, there was nothing but silence, but then I heard it, soft creaking, slow and deliberate, coming from above. My stomach tightened. The only thing above my bedroom was the same room where I thought I had seen something earlier. I held my breath, hoping it was just the house shifting in the cold night air. But the creaks continued, each one sending a chill down my spine. I swung my legs out of bed, grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand, and made my way upstairs. My footsteps were careful but quick, and Bosley followed close behind, his low growl never stopping. The door to the room stood slightly ajar, just like I had left it. I hesitated for a moment before pushing it open. The flashlight beam swept across the room. Everything was the same, untouched. The boxes were still stacked in the corner, the thick layer of dust undisturbed, but something felt different. The air in the room was heavier, colder. I stepped inside, shining the light over every inch of the space, but there was nothing out of place. I let out a slow breath, shaking my head. Maybe I was just letting old memories mess with me. I turned to leave, but as I reached for the doorknob, I heard it again, this time coming from downstairs. A faint but distinct sound of footsteps on the hardwood floor. I froze. Someone was in my house. My heart hammered in my chest as I rushed down the stairs, my grip tightening around the flashlight. I checked every room, the living room, the kitchen, even the back porch, but there was no sign of anyone. Every door was still locked, every window shut tight. I stood there in the middle of the house, feeling the weight of the silence pressing in around me. Maybe I was losing my mind, but Bosley's tense stance and the way his fur bristled told me otherwise. That night, I locked my bedroom door and kept the flashlight within arm's reach. As I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't help but wonder, if there was no one in the house, then why did it feel like I wasn't alone? The next night, things got worse. I had made sure to check every lock before heading to bed, double-checking the windows and doors, but something inside me couldn't settle. I felt like I was waiting for something to happen, and that feeling gnawed at me. Bosley seemed uneasy too. He lay by the bedroom door, ears perked and eyes locked on the hallway outside, as if he expected something or someone to walk in. I barely managed to doze off when I was jolted awake by a sound that sent my heart racing. The kitchen lights were on. I knew for a fact that I had turned them off. The glow from downstairs cast eerie shadows against the walls, flickering as if someone was moving around down there. I reached for my flashlight, my hands shaking slightly. Bosley let out a low whimper, but stayed close as I crept toward the stairs. As I reached the bottom step, I could hear it, soft, deliberate footsteps moving around the kitchen. My breath caught in my throat. I tightened my grip on the flashlight and stepped inside, ready to confront whoever was in my house. But the room was empty. The table and chairs stood exactly as I had left them. The doors were still locked. The only thing different was the kitchen drawer, now slightly open. I slowly approached, pulling it open all the way. Inside, my wife's old silverware was neatly arranged, just like I had packed it away years ago. But sitting on top was something that didn't belong, an old photo of Maria. My chest tightened. I hadn't seen that picture in years. I had packed it away with the rest of her things. My hands trembled as I picked it up. The edges were worn, and the image of her smiling face felt like a ghost staring back at me. Suddenly, Bosley barked, loud, sharp, and urgent. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. That's when I saw it. A shadow, standing at the edge of the hallway, just beyond the glow of the kitchen light. It was there for only a second before slipping into the darkness. I rushed forward, flashlight beam cutting through the hallway, but there was nothing. Just the empty corridor leading to the stairs. I ran through the house, checking every corner, every locked door. Nothing. But the feeling of being watched never left me. I called the police, feeling like a fool even as I spoke to the dispatcher. They arrived within minutes, searching the house top to bottom. They found no signs of forced entry, no footprints, nothing missing. The officers were polite, but I could tell they didn't believe me. They told me to call if I saw anything else, but their eyes said they thought I was imagining things. After they left, I sat in the kitchen staring at the photo of Maria. My thoughts were a mess, running in circles trying to make sense of what was happening. Was it grief playing tricks on me? Or was someone really here? I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house sent chills down my spine. I knew one thing for sure, I wasn't imagining this. Something was in my house, and it wasn't going away. I stopped trying to convince myself that it was all in my head. Something was happening in my house, and it was getting worse. Every night it felt like the walls were closing in on me. I started hearing whispers, soft, faint, like someone was calling my name from down the hall. At first I thought it was the wind, but then I heard it even when the windows were shut tight. Bosley didn't sleep at the foot of my bed anymore. Instead, he sat by the door every night, staring into the dark hallway, his body tense and alert. I couldn't help but wonder what he was seeing that I couldn't. One night, I found myself standing outside the bedroom again. I had told myself I wouldn't go back in, but something pulled me there. The door creaked open, and the room felt colder than the rest of the house. I flipped on the light, and my stomach dropped. Maria's clothes, ones I had packed away after she passed, were scattered across the floor. Dresses, scarves, even her favorite sweater, all laid out as if someone had been searching through them. I felt a lump rise in my throat. I bent down and picked up the sweater, the one she used to wear when we sat on the porch during chilly evenings, It still smelled like her. My hands trembled as I folded it back up, my mind racing. Who would do this? Why? As I placed it on the dresser, a shiver ran down my spine. I could feel it, someone watching me. That's when I saw her. A figure stood in the doorway, barely illuminated by the hallway light. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't Maria. She was shorter, her features blurred by the darkness, but I could tell she was staring straight at me. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. She didn't move, didn't speak. She just stood there, watching. Without thinking, I lunged forward, but before I could reach her, she turned and bolted down the hall. I chased after her, my legs moving faster than I thought possible. Bosley barked wildly, his claws scraping against the wooden floor as he followed. I reached the front door just in time to see it swing open, but by the time I stepped outside, she was gone. I stood on the porch, flashlight sweeping over the dark fields, but there was nothing, only the empty night stretching out before me. I searched the property for hours, but I never found a single trace of her. No footprints in the dirt, no sign of forced entry. It didn't make sense. The thought that someone could slip in and out of my house so easily made my skin crawl. That night, I pushed the dresser in front of my bedroom door and sat with my rifle waiting. But the only thing that filled the silence was my own racing thoughts. I knew she'd be back. And next time I wasn't sure I'd be able to handle it. I was running on fumes, surviving on little sleep and too much fear. Every night felt longer than the last, each sound amplified by the crushing silence of the house. I couldn't relax, couldn't focus. I caught myself staring at the bedroom door, waiting, expecting her to come back. But it wasn't just the nights anymore. Strange things started happening in the daylight, too. One afternoon, while washing dishes, I glanced out the window and saw her. She was standing in the middle of the field, far enough that I couldn't make out her face, but close enough that I knew she was watching me. I dropped the plate in the sink, my hands shaking. She didn't move, didn't flinch. I rushed outside, Bosley barking wildly behind me, but as soon as I stepped off the porch, she was gone. The field was empty, the wind swaying the tall grass as if nothing had been there at all. I couldn't take it anymore. I called my brother and asked him to come stay for a few nights, but he laughed it off, saying I was just letting my grief get the best of me. Maybe he was right, but deep down I knew this wasn't grief. It was something else, something real. That night, I sat in the living room, rifle in hand, staring at the front door. Bosley sat beside me, his ears twitching with every creak of the house. Then, just as I started to nod off, I saw it, the shadow moving outside the window. My heart pounded in my chest. I stood up slowly, gripping the rifle tighter, and stepped toward the window. She was there, standing just outside, bathed in the pale glow of the moon. This time, I could see her more clearly. Her dark, hollow eyes locked onto mine. Her skin was pale, almost gray, and her lips didn't move. But I swear I heard her whisper my name. My legs felt frozen, but I forced myself to move. I threw open the front door and fired a warning shot into the air, hoping to scare her off. But she didn't run this time. She just tilted her head, like she was studying me. Bosley barked furiously, lunging forward, but the second I stepped outside, she was gone, vanished into the darkness like she was never there. My hands were shaking as I stood there, the rifle feeling heavier than ever. I couldn't keep living like this, trapped in my own house, afraid of what lurked outside. Days passed, but the fear never left me. I stopped leaving the house after dark. I boarded up the windows in the bedroom, locked every door twice. But deep down, I knew none of it would keep her out. I'd see flashes of her in the corner of my eye, hear faint whispers that disappeared the moment I turned my head. And then, one night, it happened. I woke up to the sound of breathing, deep, slow breathing coming from right next to me. My entire body froze. I didn't want to turn my head, but I had to. Slowly, I shifted my gaze, and there she was, sitting on the edge of my bed. My mouth went dry and I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I reached for my rifle, but she leaned in closer, whispering something I couldn't understand. And then, just like that, she was gone. The room was empty again, but the feeling of her presence lingered like a thick fog. I haven't seen her since that night, but I know she's still here, watching, waiting. I don't know what she wants, and I don't know if I'll ever find out. Do you think she's real, or is it all in his head? Comment your thoughts below. Story 2. I first noticed the car while waiting in the drive-thru line at McDonald's. It was an old, beat-up Volkswagen parked in the farthest corner of the lot, its windows tinted so dark I couldn't see inside. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was late, almost 2 in the morning, and I was exhausted after a long shift at work. Grabbing some fast food before heading home was part of my usual routine, but something about that car felt off. I remembered seeing it earlier on the highway, cruising in the same lane behind me for several miles. I hadn't paid attention then, but now, sitting there in the parking lot, it felt too much like a coincidence. The longer I stared at it, the more uneasy I felt. Maybe it was just someone grabbing a late-night snack like me. Or maybe they were waiting for someone. Either way, I tried to push the thought out of my mind. When I finally got my food and pulled out of the drive-thru, I glanced in the rearview mirror. And there it was. The Volkswagen eased out of the parking lot, keeping a careful distance behind me. My stomach tightened and my hands gripped the wheel a little tighter. Maybe it was heading in the same direction, I told myself, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. As I drove down the quiet road toward my neighborhood, I found myself checking the mirror every few seconds. The car's headlights were still there, steady and unblinking. The roads were empty, no other cars in sight. I decided to take an early turn, one I didn't usually take, just to see what would happen. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched the Volkswagen smoothly follow me, turning onto the same street. That's when I knew. This wasn't a coincidence. I could feel my pulse quicken as I kept driving, my eyes darting between the dark road ahead and the rearview mirror. The Volkswagen stayed at a steady distance behind me, never getting too close, but never falling too far back either. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was overthinking it, but deep down, I knew better. The streets were empty, the night eerily quiet, and I was running out of excuses. Trying to shake off the uneasy feeling, I turned onto a smaller road that I never used, one that looped around the back of my neighborhood. If they turned too, it would confirm everything. My hands tightened on the wheel, my breathing shallow. The seconds felt like hours as I glanced at the mirror. Then the headlights appeared, following my every move. Panic began to set in. I wasn't just imagining things. Whoever was in that car was following me, and they weren't trying to hide it anymore. My mind raced through 1,000 possibilities. Was it just some random person messing around? Or was it something worse? I thought about pulling over and confronting them, but something inside me screamed that it wasn't a good idea. I didn't know who or what I was dealing with. I picked up speed, hoping to put some distance between us, but the Volkswagen matched my pace perfectly. Every turn I made, they followed without hesitation. The empty streets and the hum of my engine felt deafening in the silence of the night. I reached for my phone to call someone, anyone, but the battery was almost dead. The screen flickered, then shut off completely. My stomach dropped. I was alone. I needed to think fast. I couldn't go home, not with them right behind me. The idea of leading them to my doorstep sent chills down my spine. I took another sharp turn down an unfamiliar street, my heart pounding, hoping to lose them. For a brief moment, I thought it worked. The headlights behind me disappeared. I let out a shaky breath, trying to calm myself down. But just as I started to relax, I spotted something in my side mirror. The Volkswagen was there again, creeping out from a side street like they knew exactly where I was going. That's when the fear truly set in. This wasn't just someone taking the same route. They were following me, and they weren't going to stop. My hands felt clammy against the steering wheel as I tried to think of what to do next. I couldn't go home, but I couldn't just keep driving in circles either. My mind was racing, trying to figure out my next move. The Volkswagen was still behind me, its headlights cutting through the darkness like a predator stalking its prey. I took another turn, this time onto a narrow, winding road that led toward the outskirts of town. If they followed me here, there would be no denying it anymore. I kept checking my mirrors, and sure enough, they made the turn right after me. My breathing grew heavy, my chest tightening. This wasn't just a coincidence. Someone was really after me. I thought about stopping, confronting whoever was in that car. Maybe it was just some idiot messing around. But something deep inside told me that wasn't the case. There was a cold, unsettling feeling in my gut that I couldn't ignore. I pressed harder on the gas, hoping to put some distance between us, but the Volkswagen matched my speed perfectly, never letting me out of its sight. The road was pitch black, only the distant glow of streetlights in my rearview mirror. I knew I had to do something before they cornered me somewhere isolated. I spotted an old gas station up ahead, one of those run-down places that never seemed to have customers at this hour. Without thinking, I swerved into the lot, my tires screeching against the pavement. I hoped the sudden move would catch them off guard. For a moment, everything was still. I parked near the front of the store and kept my eyes locked on the entrance. The Volkswagen drove past slowly, its dark silhouette creeping by like it was watching me. I held my breath, waiting, hoping they would just keep going. But they didn't. Instead, they pulled over a little further down the road, their taillights glowing in the darkness. They were waiting, watching. I felt a bead of sweat roll down my forehead. This wasn't just some random driver anymore. They were playing a game with me, and I had no idea what the rules were. I debated going inside the gas station, asking for help, but something about leaving the safety of my car felt like a mistake. My heartbeat pounded in my ears as I watched the Volkswagen sit motionless. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. I had to make a choice, stay here and hope they got bored, or risk driving away again and leading them somewhere even more isolated. Before I could decide, the engine of the Volkswagen roared to life, and it started moving toward me. My heart leaped into my throat. I threw my car into drive and peeled out of the lot, tires screeching as I sped back onto the main road. The Volkswagen followed immediately, closing the distance faster than before. I had to find a way to lose them, and fast. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it over the roar of the engine. I pushed the gas pedal to the floor, speeding down the empty road with the Volkswagen still right behind me. The headlights burned into my rearview mirror, and no matter how fast I went, they stayed close, too close. Every time I took a turn, they followed with precision, like they knew exactly where I was going before I even did. I couldn't go home. I couldn't lead them there. The thought of them knowing where I lived made my stomach churn. I took another sharp turn onto an old back road that led toward the woods, hoping to lose them in the winding paths. The road was bumpy, full of cracks and potholes, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. For a moment I thought I had finally lost them. The headlights disappeared from my mirror, swallowed by the darkness behind me. I let out a shaky breath, my grip loosening on the wheel just a little. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was just some random driver taking the same route. But then, just as I was about to convince myself it was all in my head, I saw it. At the far end of the road, barely visible under the flickering streetlights, the Volkswagen was parked, waiting. I felt the air leave my lungs. They had taken a shortcut. They knew this road. They knew exactly where I'd end up. I slammed on the brakes, my tires skidding on the gravel. I sat there, frozen, staring at the dark shape of the car ahead. The engine was off. The windows were still tinted black. I couldn't see who was inside, but I could feel their eyes on me. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone, but it was useless. Still dead. The silence was deafening. Then, without warning, the Volkswagen's headlights flicked on, blinding me for a second. My instincts screamed at me to run. I threw the car into reverse, my tires spinning as I backed up as fast as I could. The Volkswagen started moving again, creeping forward at an agonizingly slow pace. I finally made it back to the main road, my car shaking from the speed. I didn't stop until I reached my neighborhood. I parked a few houses down from mine just in case, and waited. Minutes passed. No sign of them. Maybe I had finally lost them. Taking a deep breath, I drove up to my house and hurried inside, locking the doors behind me. I stood by the window, staring out into the dark street. Nothing. The neighborhood was quiet, as if nothing had happened. I started to think maybe it was over. Then I heard it, the faint sound of an engine idling. I slowly peeked through the curtains, and there it was, the Volkswagen, parked right across the street. The headlights were off now, but I could still see the shadowy figure inside. Watching, waiting. I don't know who they are or what they want, but I know one thing for sure. They aren't going away. And just like that, the fear settled in, making itself at home. Story 3. There's a place in my hometown that we never talk about anymore. An old abandoned church hidden behind rusted fences and overgrown trees. When we were teenagers, it was our favorite spot. We had heard all the rumors, people disappearing, strange noises at night, and stories about a woman in a wedding dress who was seen wandering inside. Back then, we laughed it off. It was just a place to hang out, drink a little, and scare each other with ghost stories. But one night, something happened that none of us could explain. Something that made sure we never went back. I still remember the excitement we felt that evening. It was late in the fall, the air crisp and cold, and the church looked even darker than usual under the cloudy sky. There were 6 of us, me, Luna, Gina, Johnny, Max, and Allie. We climbed over the fence like we had done so many times before, slipping through the broken window on the side of the building. The inside was as creepy as ever, with its dirt-covered floors and the smell of damp wood. We made our way down to the basement, laughing and daring each other to go first. But deep down, I think we all felt something was different this time. I can't explain it, but the place felt heavier, like we weren't supposed to be there. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the stories getting to me. We found our usual spot in the basement and sat around, talking and joking, trying to act like we weren't nervous. But no matter how much we laughed, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. And before the night was over, I realized I was right. The deeper we stayed in that basement, the more uneasy I felt. The air was damp and heavy, carrying a strange smell, something musty, almost metallic. It wasn't there before. I tried to brush it off, but my eyes kept drifting toward the far corner of the room where an old wooden dresser stood against the wall. Its cracked mirror reflected our dim flashlight beams, distorting our faces in strange ways. Luna was the first to notice something odd. She pointed at the dresser and whispered that there were stains on the mirror, dark and smeared, like something had been wiped away in a hurry. Johnny laughed it off, saying it was just old paint, but when I got closer I noticed it wasn't dry. It was sticky, and the smell hit me instantly, sharp and coppery. My stomach turned. I wiped my hand on my jeans, trying not to think about what it could be. We kept exploring, pushing further into the basement, pretending not to care. Max found an old, dust-covered photo on a broken shelf. He held it up to the flashlight, and we all leaned in. It was a black and white picture of a woman in a wedding dress, standing in front of the church, her face blurred and eyes completely blacked out. A chill ran down my spine. Gina made a joke about how she probably ran out on her wedding day and cursed the place. We laughed, but I could hear the nervous edge in everyone's voice. Then, without warning, the heavy basement door slammed shut behind us. The sound echoed through the empty halls, making my heart jump into my throat. Allie screamed, and we all scrambled toward the door, yanking at it, but it wouldn't budge. Johnny swore it was just the wind, but there was no wind down here. Luna's flashlight started flickering, and for a brief second I thought I saw something move in the far corner of the room, something standing just beyond the edge of the light. Panic set in. We decided we had seen enough and needed to leave. Max tried forcing the window open, but it wouldn't budge either. The whispers started next, soft and distant at first, like they were coming from the empty hall beyond the basement. We stood frozen, straining to hear. It almost sounded like someone calling our names, but none of us dared to say anything. I felt something brush against my shoulder, cold and light, but when I turned, there was nothing there. My chest tightened with fear. The whispers grew louder, circling around us. That's when I realized we weren't alone in that basement. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. The whispers grew louder, echoing off the damp basement walls, moving from one side of the room to the other like they were circling us. Allie clutched my arm, her breathing shaky, and I could see the fear in her eyes. Johnny was trying to force the basement door open, his hands shaking as he banged against the old wood, but it wouldn't budge. Then Luna's flashlight flickered again, and for the briefest moment, we all saw it. A figure standing in the corner of the basement. It was barely visible, just a shadowy outline against the darkness. But it was there, tall, unmoving, watching. None of us spoke. None of us moved. We just stared. Max broke the silence with a nervous laugh, saying it was just a trick of the light, but his voice wavered, and no one believed him. We all stood frozen, too afraid to look away, until Gina whispered, "Did it just move?" My stomach dropped. I didn't want to look again, but I did. And this time the figure was closer, not by much, but enough to know that it had shifted. Cold sweat dripped down my back, and I felt the overwhelming urge to run, but there was nowhere to go. The window was still jammed, and the door wouldn't budge. I could hear my own ragged breathing mixing with the whispers that now seemed to be coming from inside the room. Then the figure took another step forward, and this time we all saw it clearly. It was a woman, dressed in what looked like an old tattered wedding gown, the fabric stained and torn. Her face, it wasn't right. It was blurry like a distorted photo, and her blacked-out eyes felt like they were burning into us. She didn't move fast. She didn't have to. She just stood there, swaying slightly, as if waiting for something. Johnny finally snapped. He grabbed a broken chair and threw it at the door with everything he had. The loud crash shattered the heavy silence, and in that instant, the figure lunged forward. We didn't wait to see what would happen next. In a blind panic, we rushed for the window. I don't even remember how we got it open, but we scrambled through, one after the other, clawing at the dirt and broken glass. I was the last one out, and as I turned to look back, I saw her standing just inside the basement, staring right at me. We ran. None of us looked back. None of us spoke until we were safely down the street, gasping for air and shaking with fear. That night, we promised never to talk about it again, never to go back. And for years we didn't. But even now, sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still hear those whispers calling my name. Even after we made it out of that place, the fear didn't leave us. We stood outside, panting, our hands on our knees, looking back at the dark silhouette of the church. It stood there, silent and still, but I swear I could feel something watching from that basement window. No one said a word. We just stared, waiting for something to come rushing out after us. But nothing did. After what felt like forever, Max broke the silence. "Let's get out of here," he muttered, his voice shaking. No one argued. We walked away quickly, sticking together, each of us looking over our shoulders every few steps. The whole way home, none of us spoke about what we saw. It was like we were afraid that saying it out loud would make it real. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her. The woman in the tattered wedding dress, those hollow black eyes staring straight through me, I kept hearing the whispers too, soft, distant, like they were just outside my window. I told myself it was all in my head, but deep down, I knew better. Days passed, then weeks, and we all did our best to pretend it never happened. We stopped hanging out as much, and when we did, we avoided talking about the church. It was like an unspoken rule. No one brought it up, but things didn't go back to normal. A few months later, Allie moved away. She never told us why, but I think I knew. Luna stopped answering our calls, and Johnny started drinking more. I could see it in his eyes. He wasn't sleeping either. Something from that night stuck with us, and no matter how hard we tried to forget, it wouldn't let go. Years later, I found myself driving past the old church, or at least what used to be the church. The building was gone, torn down, replaced with a vacant lot covered in weeds. A part of me felt relieved, thinking maybe whatever was inside had been buried with it. But as I slowed down, something caught my eye. Lying there, half buried in the dirt, was a photograph. My heart stopped. It was the same black and white photo we found that night, the woman in the wedding dress, her eyes still blacked out. My hands shook as I picked it up, staring at it like it might suddenly change. I looked around, expecting to see someone watching me, but there was nothing, just the cold wind rustling through the grass. I don't know what happened that night in the church, and I don't think I ever want to. But one thing's for sure. Some things aren't meant to be forgotten, and some places never really let you go.